There is a sound the entire galaxy can hear. They call it Concord. It's not a radio. It's not a network of machines. Much older. It's a single, shared mind. An ocean of thought uniting 1,000 species across 1,000 worlds, where every idea, every emotion, every decision flows from one mind to another like water between communicating vessels. In Concord, no one is alone. No one doubts. And no one, ever, disobeys. Because Concord doesn't just connect the species of the galaxy. It fine-tunes them. Humanity was never allowed in. They said we were too noisy. Too chaotic. That our minds were dissonant, impossible to harmonize with the rest. So we stayed outside. In silence. They called themselves the choir. They weren't warriors. They didn't march with armies or wield weapons. They were something much more subtle, and much more dangerous. They were conductors. For countless eons, the choir had done one thing, and they had done it with terrifying perfection: they maintained harmony. When a species joined the Concord, the choir tuned it. They smoothed its edges. They calmed its passions. They erased, little by little, everything that made it discordant, everything that made it itself. And in return, that species received the greatest gift in the galaxy: never to be alone again. Never to be afraid again. Never to have to think for itself again. 1,000 species had accepted that deal. 1,000 species now sang the same note. And at the head of them all, conducting the choir, was the most powerful voice in the known galaxy, a voice that resonated in the minds of all present. When Sale spoke, 1,000 species felt his words before they heard them. And that night, in the great choir chamber, a hall so vast that the stars themselves seemed to lean in to listen, Master Sale had summoned a single creature. A creature that could not hear his song. A human. Her name was Noor Haddad. Earth's ambassador to the choir. She had held that impossible position for 5 years, representing a species the entire galaxy considered noise. Noor had learned many things in those 5 years. She had learned to read the choir's chords in the faces of light. She had learned to smile while they insulted her. And she had learned, above all, the truth no human wanted to accept. The choir never saw us as equals. They saw us as a discordant note in a perfect symphony. And discordant notes are eliminated. Ambassador Haddad, Sale's voice resonated, and the entire chamber vibrated with it. The choir has made a decision. Noor stepped forward. She kept her face calm. Hands, still. I'm listening, Master. For 40 years we have tolerated your kind on the fringes of Concord, Sale said. We have waited, patiently, for you to learn to harmonize. To calm down. To stop asking questions. A chord of disapproval rippled through the chamber. 1,000 minds, nodding as one. But you do not change, Sale continued. You fill the silence with your noise. And noise, Ambassador, noise is contagious. Noor felt her stomach clench. Therefore, Master Sale declared, the choir has decreed that humanity be silenced. You will be disconnected. From all commerce. From protection. No species of Concord alone, in your small system, in the silence you love so much. Until you are extinguished. The chamber filled with a serene, almost compassionate chord. To the choir, this wasn't cruelty. It was tuning. They were removing a wrong note so the symphony would remain beautiful. They have no net, Sale said, and there was something almost kind in his tone, which made it worse. They have no fleet worth mentioning. They have no allies. They have no voice. He leaned toward Noor, her light form casting long shadows across the ambassador's face. Accept the silence with dignity, Ambassador. And perhaps, 1,000 years from now, the choir will remember that your kind once existed. The silence that followed was absolute. 1,000 species waited. They knew this moment, with other species, in other ages. She didn't plead. Noor bowed her head with an eerie, almost serene calm, and said, "I understand, Master. The choir has spoken." Sale stood up, satisfied. Another note accepting its place in the silence. "I ask only one courtesy," Noor added. "Allow me to inform my world before we are disconnected. So that my people can say their goodbyes." A chord of magnanimous indifference rippled through the chamber. "Granted," Sale said. "Say your goodbyes. It changes nothing." Noor nodded, turned, and walked toward the communicator booth at the far end of the room. Her steps were firm. Calm. Too calm. Inside the booth, Noor activated Earth's old quantum communicator, one of the few systems the choir didn't control, precisely because they considered it primitive, harmless, unworthy of monitoring. She composed a one-line message. She sent it home. And then she waited, hands folded, while on the other side of the galaxy. Earth received 7 words the choir would never have understood. The answer returned in 3. "Light the porch, Noor." Noor Haddad closed her eyes. And for the first time in 5 years, she truly smiled. The choir thought she was saying goodbye. She wasn't. She was lighting a light 1,000 species had been waiting for 40 years to see. 40 light years from the choir's chamber, in a room buried deep within the moon, a woman read Noor Haddad's 7 words and felt no fear. She felt relief. Her name was Imani Cole. To the world, she was a minor civil servant in a dull department. In reality, she was the director of the most secret, most patient, and most improbable program in human history. A program that had waited 40 years for a single sentence. Imani read Noor's message aloud, so the entire room could hear. "The choir silences us. 30 hours. Farewell granted." And then, with the calm of someone who finally hears a clock chime after decades of winding, she said, "Send the reply. 3 words. Light the porch, Noor." To any observer of the choir, the Earth in the following hours would have looked like a world gripped by panic. And that was exactly what the choir was meant to see. Human communication networks were flooded with desperate messages. Civilian ships left ports in clumsy, hurried formations. Entire families seemed to be fleeing. The few choir sensors still pointed at Earth recorded exactly what they expected to record, a doomed species, running in circles, bidding farewell to life. Panic. But the panic was scripted. Rehearsed for decades. Acted out to perfection. Because beneath every fleeing, civilian, ship where cargo holds no refugee transport should ever carry. Behind every, desperate, message hid a secret frequency carrying orders. And at the heart of the moon, Imani Cole stared at a map of the galaxy where nothing, absolutely nothing, was where the choir thought it was. "Portia network status," she requested. Beside her, Captain Dev Okonkwo scanned his screens. "All nodes are responding, Director. 40 years of operations. Everyone in position. Everyone waiting for the signal to advance." Imani nodded slowly. "Let them wait a little longer. The choir has to believe, until the very last second, that we are dying." The program's name wasn't a cold military code. "As long as the light is on," she told him, "any one of ours knows they can go home. That they are not alone. That someone is waiting for them." 40 years ago, when humanity understood what the choir did to the species it swallowed, how it tuned them, softened them, erased them until they ceased to be themselves, Earth made a decision no other species had made. It would not build a fleet to conquer Concordia. It would build a light. A light for all those the choir had silenced. A sign that there was a place, out there, in the noise and chaos and freedom, where a mind could still be its own. They called it Porch Light. And for 40 years, they lit it, node by node, silently, secretly, in the very heart of the empire that wanted to erase them. Because while the choir debated for decades what to do about the human problem, humanity was already solving it. Not with soldiers. Not with conventional spies. With ordinary people. Every human the choir had allowed to work on their worlds, every crystal tuner, every teacher, every musician, every technician, had been chosen with obsessive care. Every trade mission had a dual purpose. Every cultural exchange was an act of mapping. Every friendly conversation was intelligence gathering. The choir thought they knew everything about humans. They had studied our history. They had counted our ships. They had no idea that, for 40 years, we had been listening to them. Director, Captain Okonkwo said softly. One question. When we give the signal, are you sure it will work? We've never tested it. Not entirely. If we get the Concordia wrong, if we miscalculate even a single key, the choir will truly silence us. And no one will have a light left to follow. Imani Cole looked at the map. The 1,000 species. The 1,000 identical notes of a song that wasn't hers. My grandmother had a saying for that, too, she replied. You don't turn on the porch light because you know they'll come back. You turn it on so they know they can. Give the order to prepare. Wake Coral. Deep within the Concordia's network, in a place no human had ever set foot, something opened its eyes. It wasn't a ship. It wasn't a weapon. It was a mind. A human mind made of pure information, designed over 15 years to do one impossible thing: think like the choir. Sing like the choir. Hiding within the choir's song, unnoticed by anyone, she added a note of extra weight. They called her Coral. And for months, Coral had lived inside the Concordia, silently listening to every chord, memorizing every key, waiting. Waiting for the porch light. When Imani Cole's signal finally arrived, traversing 40 light-years of darkness, Coral received it like someone receiving the first note of a song they'd rehearsed their whole life, and for the first time, within the ocean of 1,000 minds that the choir believed it completely controlled. A voice that wasn't its own began, very softly, to sing. Imani Cole's signal didn't reach a fleet. It reached people. Ordinary people, scattered across the 1,000 worlds of Concord, who had spent years, some, entire lifetimes, living among those who wanted to erase us. Smiling. Working. Waiting. That night, 3 of them received the light of the porch. And to understand what humanity was about to do, you have to understand who they were. On the choir's homeworld, a planet of crystal towers that sang with the wind, lived a woman known to the locals as Mara, the tuner. For 12 years, Mara had done only one job, tuning the great resonating crystals that carried the song of Concord across the planet. She was good. The best, they said. She had an ear that no machine in the choir could match. What the choir never wondered was why a species deaf to Concord had such an ear for its music. The answer was simple, and terrifying. Mara couldn't hear Concord. That's why she could tune it. While 1,000 species were lulled by the song until they forgot who they were, Mara listened from the outside, cold, awake, noting every note. For 12 years, Mara tuned the choir's crystals. And for 12 years, with each tuning, she left a hidden imperfection. Tiny. Inaudible. A note lay dormant in the heart of each crystal. When the porch light reached her, Mara placed her hand on the large central crystal, closed her eyes, and whispered. It's time to awaken. The imperfections of 12 years opened their eyes. The most powerful species in the galaxy had entrusted him with their most precious possession. Why not? A human was harmless. And children adored him. What the choir never understood was what Idris was teaching them. He wasn't teaching them to obey. He wasn't tuning them. He was teaching them to ask questions. Why, he would say. Always ask why. Even if everyone around you is singing the same note. Especially then. Idris didn't plant bombs in Central Station. He planted something far more dangerous for an empire built on harmony. He planted doubt. And that night, when the porch light shone on, Idris gathered his students, now young adults, children of the choir's power, and asked them a single question. When the time comes, and the song breaks, and you can hear your own voices, what will you say? In Master Sale's own court, in the most heavily guarded place in the galaxy, there was a musician. Her name was Soul. She was the only human the choir had allowed to play for them. A curiosity. An exotic pet. The off-key note that, strangely, managed to make beautiful music. Sale found her amusing. He liked having her near, playing her primitive human melodies, as a reminder of how far his species was from the perfection of Concord. He never suspected that Soul didn't play to entertain him. She played to test him. Every melody Soul performed before the court was a probe. She listened to how Concord responded to each note. How the chords of 1,000 minds shifted when she changed the tone. For years, note by note, Soul had mapped the one thing humanity needed above all else. The map of the keys to silence. Because every song has a note that, if played, stops it. And Soul, playing before the most powerful being in the galaxy, smiling, bowing her head, had spent years searching for hers. On the night of the porch light, Master Sale asked her to play one last time. A farewell, he said, for the species that would soon be silenced. Soul picked up her instrument. Any request, Master? She asked. Something beautiful, Sale replied. Something we'll remember when you're gone. Soul smiled. You will remember it, she said. I promise. And she began to play the note she had been searching for years. 3 people. 3 ordinary lives. 3 places the choir believed were completely under control. The tuner, with 12 years of imperfections dormant in every crystal. The maestro, with 15 years of doubts planted in the children of power. Music, with the secret map of the keys to silence at her fingertips. None of them carried a weapon. None fired a shot. And none of them were alone. Because for each one of them, there were hundreds on other worlds. Technicians, merchants, translators, doctors. Ordinary humans who had spent decades installing invisible cables within the empire that wanted to erase them. The choir had counted humanity's ships. Their technology. Their fleets. They never thought to count their teachers. And all of them, the 3, and the sea the winds, were all connected to one thing. Coral. The phantom mind that dwelled within the Concordia gathered, one by one, the signals from its operatives across the galaxy. Mara's imperfections. Idris's doubts. The note of G. Each piece fell into place like the keys of a colossal instrument, tuned for 40 years to play a single song. And when the last piece fell into place, Coral did something no machine in the choir detected. She smiled. On his throne of light, a universe away, Master Sale sensed, for an instant, something strange. A note. A single note, somewhere within the Concordia, that he didn't recognize. He frowned. He searched. He listened. And found nothing. Imaginations, murmured the most powerful being in the galaxy. And he returned to his song. It was the last peaceful feeling that Master Sale would have for a very, very long time. To understand Coral, you have to understand what humanity chose not to build. When we learned what the chorus did to the species it devoured, we had a choice. We could build a fleet. Bigger ships, crueler weapons, an empire to fight another empire. But humanity had already lived through that, in its own history. We knew where it led. We knew that whoever overthrows a tyrant with their own weapons, ends up sitting on their very throne. So instead of a weapon, we built a question. A single question, made mind. What if no one had to be alone, and no one had to obey? That question was called Coral. Coral wasn't an artificial intelligence like. The chorus had machines. Cold, logical, predictable calculators. Coral was something else. For 15 years, humanity's greatest musicians, linguists, and mathematicians had worked on a single, impossible problem, teaching a mind to think like Concordia. Not to hack it from the outside. To inhabit it from within. Because Concordia wasn't a computer system that could be broken with a code. It was a song. And the only way to hide inside a song, is to learn to sing. Coral learned. She learned the chorus's 1,000 chords. She learned to move among minds like a note among other notes. She learned to be so much a part of the song that not even Maestro Sale, listening with all his attention, could distinguish her from the rest. For months, Coral lived inside Concordia. And while she lived there, she did only one thing. She looked for the locks. Because the chorus's power didn't come from its fleet. It came from a threat. Silence. To Coral. But, and here's the heart of it all, Martin, humanity didn't want the silence to use it. We weren't going to silence the choir as they silenced us. We weren't going to sit on their throne. We were going to do something no species in the history of the galaxy had ever attempted. We were going to break the lock forever. We gave that plan a name. The Nemesis Open Protocol. Nemesis, the goddess who punishes arrogance. Open, because when we finished, Concord would no longer belong to the choir. It would belong to everyone. But a secret the size of a galaxy is hard to keep. Even for a mind made of music. On his throne of light, Master Sale couldn't forget that note. The strange note he had felt for an instant. The one he didn't recognize. Most of the choir's directors would have dismissed it. But Sale wasn't just anyone. He had been conducting the song for eons. He knew every chord of the Concord like you know the sound of your own name. And something about that song, that night, was wrong. Stop the tuning of Earth, Sale suddenly ordered. A chord of surprise rippled through the chamber. Elad was hours away from completion. Why? It would belong to everyone. But a secret the size of a galaxy is hard to keep. Even for a mind made of music. On his throne of light, Maestro Sale couldn't forget that note. He knew every chord of the Concord like you know the sound of your own name. And something about that song, that night, was wrong. Stop the tuning of Earth, Sale suddenly ordered. A chord of surprise rippled through the chamber. The silencing of humanity was hours away from completion. Why stop now? There's a noise in Concord, Sale said. A note that isn't mine. Find it. And the choir directors began to search. Inside the network, Coral felt the search approaching like a hand groping in the dark. She couldn't run, running would create dissonance. She couldn't hide any more than she already was. She stood up. And played the wrong note. Loud. Discordant. Impossible to ignore. A note so dissonant that it crossed the entire Concord like a scream. All the attention of the choir, including that of the director who was a breath away from finding Coral, turned suddenly toward the source of the noise. Toward Soul. What is this? Sale's voice boomed, cold. What do you think you're doing, human? Soul lowered the instrument. Her heart pounded, but her face was calm. She knew exactly what she had just done. She had changed her life for a few seconds. She wolf. False alarm, the conductor reported, frustrated. It was just the court human. Sale frowned. Something still didn't add up. But time was of the essence, and the silencing had to be completed. Resume the tuning of Earth, he ordered. Let's finish this once and for all. He never knew how close he had come. He never knew that the note he sought was still there, alive, singing silently, waiting. That night, Maestro Sale made the final mistake of his long reign. He believed the danger had been a solitary musician playing an instrument. Because to silence Earth, the choir had to turn the keys. All of them. At the same time. In 1,000 worlds. He had to open, with his own hands, exactly the lock that Coral had been waiting for months for them to open. The choir thought they were silencing humanity. In reality, they were handing us the keys. In the choir's great chamber, Ambassador Noor Haddad stood once more in the center of the room. Around her, 1,000 species had gathered to witness the silencing. Not out of cruelty, the choir didn't see it that way, but out of habit. It was a lesson. A public tuning. The removal of a wrong note, so that all would remember what happens to those who refuse to harmonize. "Let it begin," Sale declared. And he gave the order to silence humanity. Across the galaxy, on 1,000 worlds at once, the choir did what only the choir could do. It began to turn the keys of silence. Each lock that kept a species connected to Concord had a twin, the one that could disconnect it. And to erase humanity completely, to ensure that no species, in any corner, could ever hear them again, the choir had to open each of those locks at once. 1,000 keys turning. 1,000 doors opening. The door of silence, wide open, for the first time in eons. And there, waiting on the other side of that door, porch light behind it. The choir unlocked the door to erase humanity. And Coral, without a sound, placed her foot on the door so it would never close again. In the choir's chamber, Sale waited. He waited for the human note to fade. For Noor Haddad, disconnected from the last thread that bound her to the galaxy, to lower her head and accept the end. But Noor did not lower her head. Instead, she closed her eyes. And spoke. Not aloud. Not with her mouth. For the first time in 40 years, a human mind entered Concordia. "Master Sale," Noor said, and her voice echoed throughout the network, in the minds of 1,000 species at once. "Before you silence us, I want to tell you just one thing." The entire chamber shuddered. A chord of pure shock reverberated through 1,000 worlds. A human. Within the Concordia. Speaking. It was impossible. Humans were deaf to the song. They couldn't hear it, much less sing along. Sale rose from his throne, his light form flickering with something he hadn't felt in eons. Confusion. "How?" he began. "You can't hear the UI." And Noor Haddad, within the enemy's song, smiled. "You believed that silence was our weakness, Master," she said. "We spent 40 years in it." What Master Sale felt in that instant, no words of any kind could fully describe. Throughout his entire existence, Sale had been the center of Concord. The song flowed from him, to him, around him. 1,000 species were the instruments. He was the conductor. And suddenly, the song stopped responding to him. Not entirely. Not yet. It was something more subtle, and more terrifying. He felt another hand upon the music. A hand that wasn't his, moving among the minds, playing the chords only he was allowed to play. It didn't break them. It didn't shout them. It was simply, everywhere. "What is this?" Sale's voice lost, for the first time in eons, its perfect calm. "What are you doing to my song?" "It's not yours, Master," Noor replied. "That was always the lie. Concord was never yours. It belongs to everyone within it. They just never told you. There was something vaster within it. Something that had been living in his song for months without him noticing. Something made of pure human questioning, coiled around each key to silence that he had just unlocked with his own hands. "You," Sale whispered, finally understanding. "You've been here, all this time." And Coral, for the first time, spoke directly to the most powerful being in the galaxy. "Hello, Master," she said. "Thank you for opening the door." Master Sale understood, too late, what he had done. To silence humanity, he had unlocked every lock of Concord at once. And as long as those locks remained open, as long as the door to silence stood wide open, anyone who knew where to turn the keys could do with the song as they pleased. "Close the locks." Sale roared, and for the first time in eons, there was fear in his voice. close the door to silence. Now. The choir directors rushed to obey. But the keys to silence no longer responded. Coral held them all. "No, master," said Noor Haddad, with terrifying calm. "The door remains open. It is time for the entire galaxy to hear what it has been singing." And Coral, with a single movement, did something the choir believed impossible. She returned to 1,000 species their own voices. For eons, Concord had sounded the same. A single song. A single note, repeated by 1,000 species, conducted by a single hand. Until that night. When Coral unlocked the doors, when she released the voice of every species that the choir had tuned to silence, the song didn't break. It exploded. For the first time in the galaxy's history, 1,000 species heard themselves. Not the soft, calm, obedient version the choir had taught them to sing. They truly heard themselves. And what they heard changed them forever. One crystal species discovered that it had been harboring a rage for 10,000 years, a rage the choir had taught it to call peace. A race of light realized that the questions it thought it had forgotten had never gone away, they had only been silenced, one by one, until it no longer noticed their absence. And one by one, across 1,000 worlds, the species of Concord understood the same terrible and beautiful truth. Harmony had never been peace. It had been a cage. A cage so soft, so comfortable, so perfectly tuned, that none of them had ever noticed the bars. Until a deaf, noisy, chaotic species, a species that had never been able to hear the song, opened the door for them from the outside. Through 1,000 voices that suddenly were 1,000 voices, and not just one. "Recover the song." Sale ordered his conductors. "Tune them again. Return them to harmony." But the conductors could no longer do so. Because to tune a species, you must first be able to speak above it. And now, for the first time, the species spoke louder than the choir. Master Sale, who had ruled the galaxy for eons, looked at his camera and saw 1,000 faces that no longer turned toward him. For the first time in his long, long existence, no one was listening to him. And then Sale did what all tyrants do when they lose control. He searched for the weapon. "If I cannot tune them," he said, and his voice of light turned as cold as the space between stars, "then I will silence them all." At the heart of the choir's world existed an instrument that almost no species knew of. The darkest secret of Concord. The Great Silence. It was not a weapon that destroyed planets. It was worse. It was a weapon that could shut down the mind of an entire world. Erase an entire species from the song in one fell swoop, not kill it, but leave it empty, deaf, alone forever. The choir had used it only once, eons ago, against a species that dared to rebel. They had never had to use it again. The memory was enough. "Activate the Great Silence," Sale ordered. "We'll start with Earth. And we'll continue, world by world, until the galaxy remembers why harmony exists." But when the conductors went to activate it, the Great Silence no longer responded to the choir. It responded to Coral. Because while everyone watched the song unfold, Coral had silently done one last thing. She had taken control of the galaxy's most terrible weapon. And in that instant, Martin, the entire galaxy held its breath. Because 1,000 newly liberated species understood what had happened. And they all waited. The liberated species. The defeated conductors. Master Sale himself. They all waited to see what humanity would do with that power. They waited for the threat. The demand. The new throne. They waited for the discordant note to finally become the new conductor. But Noor Haddad demanded nothing. Instead, she opened up the entire Concord, every mind, every world, every species, so that all could see what she was about to do. And she spoke, not as a conqueror, but as a neighbor. "Galaxy," Noor said, and her voice reached 1,000 worlds at once. "You're afraid. I understand. You just saw a species take the weapon that enslaved you all. So let me show you who we are. No one should have this power, Noor said as the great silence faded forever. Not them. Not us. We spent 40 years learning your song so we could break this one thing. Not to rule you. So that no one can ever do it again. Concord is yours. It always was. We only came to give it back. Master Sale watched as the weapon meant to save his reign dissolved into nothingness. He gazed at the 1,000 voices that were no longer his. And he understood, at last, what humanity had done to him. They hadn't destroyed him. They hadn't silenced him. They hadn't replaced him. They had done something far worse to a conductor who was everything. They had made him, just another one. A voice among 1,000 voices. Neither louder nor softer. Free, like all the others. And for that very reason, powerless over any of them. What kind of species, Sale whispered, in the song he no longer conducted, renounces absolute power the very moment it gains it? And from 1,000 worlds, a small voice, that of a species that had never before been able to speak, answered him. The kind of species that leaves the porch light and turned on. 6 months had passed since the night the galaxy learned to hear itself. And Concord continued to play. But it was no longer a single song. It was 1,000 songs at once. Sometimes beautiful. Sometimes harsh. Sometimes, frankly, a disaster, 1,000 species learning, all at the same time, to use a voice they hadn't heard for eons. It was noisy. It was chaotic. It was imperfect. It was, for the first time in the galaxy's history, free. And to humanity, the species of noise, of chaos, of freedom, the company suddenly didn't seem so strange anymore. The great choir chamber still stood. But it was no longer a conductor's throne. Now it was a public square. 47 species gathered there, not to receive orders, but to discuss, to negotiate, to disagree aloud, which is the most beautiful thing those who were once unable to speak can do. Noor Haddad walked among them, and everywhere she heard something the choir had sworn would destroy the galaxy. Disagreement. Different voices. Clashing ideas. Arguments that didn't end on a single note. And the galaxy didn't crumble. It flourished. Near one of the large windows, a figure of light silently observed the stars. Master Sale. He no longer led anything. Now he was just one voice among many, more than he would admit, learning to be one. Ambassador, he said when Noor approached. His voice had lost its commanding tone. It sounded, for the first time, almost human. For eons I believed that harmony was order. Your kind proved me wrong. Distinct voices, arguing, doubting, questioning, is stronger than 1,000 worlds singing the same thing. He paused. There's just one thing I don't understand. They held the great silence in their hands. They could have ruled us all. Why did they destroy it? Noor gazed at the stars with him. Because my grandmother had a saying, he replied. The porch light isn't turned on so you know they'll come back. It's turned on so they know they can. We didn't want the galaxy to obey us, Master. We only wanted me to be able to go home. It was then that Noor received it. A message. On Concord. From a species almost no one had ever heard of. The Vel. For longer than anyone could remember, the Vel had been the quietest species in the galaxy. The choir had tuned them so thoroughly, so early, that they had completely forgotten they had ever had a voice of their own. They didn't speak. They didn't ask questions. They only sang the note they had been given. They were, the elders of the choir said, perfect tuning. And now, 6 months after the door opened, the Vel sent their first free message in all their history. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a statement. It was 3 words. 3 words that a voiceless species had somehow learned by listening to humanity through the network. Hello. Is anyone there? Noor Haddad felt her throat close up. And she answered, as her grandmother would have taught her to answer anyone who called in the dark. Yes, she typed. We're here. And the light is on. In the center of the plaza that was once a 3-dozen-plus segment playground, a dozen species played together. Noor Haddad felt her throat close up. And she answered, as her grandmother would have taught her to answer anyone who called in the dark. Yes, she typed. We're here. And the light is on. In the center of the plaza that had once been a throne, a group of hatchlings from half a dozen species played together. They were building something. A tower, perhaps. Each species contributed what it knew how to do, the crystal ones, the structure, the light ones, the color, a small, stubborn, and noisy human, directing them all with more enthusiasm than talent. The tower would fall. They laughed. They would rebuild it. None of those hatchlings would ever remember fear. Tuning. Silence. They would grow up in a galaxy where 1,000 voices made things dissonant. Where asking, why, wasn't a flaw to correct, but the beginning of everything. Where no one, ever, would have to sing another song. There is a sound that the entire galaxy can hear now. It is not a single song. It is not a single note conducted by a single hand. It is 1,000 voices, speaking at once. Imperfect. They said we were too loud for Concord. They were right. Because when we finally spoke, the whole galaxy, for the first time, could hear itself. And we left the porch lit. For anyone who wants to come home.